You're listening to the Useful Science Podcast. This week we're talking about office fitness. Useful Science is a website where we post one-sentence summaries of scientific research relevant to your everyday life. On this podcast, we bring on a rotating panel of our science contributors to pick out a few items from the Useful Science archives and dive deep into them. So while the website gives you the short, tweetable version of scientific research, our goal here is to give you the full story. Let's meet our hosts for this week.
Kia ora, my name's Julia Talbot-Jones. I'm a lecturer in Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand, and most of my research is based in the field of economics, but also touches on environmental management and environmental governance.
I'm Susan Rogers-Venketlake. I'm an investigator with the Global Strategy Lab at York University in Toronto, where I study global health policy, especially around transnational health threats.
And my name is Cameron Spencer. I'm not a scientist. I'm a web developer and a web designer, and I work on the Useful Science website. So, Julia, let's just dive into your article.
Great. Well, I'm talking about an article today titled "Stair Walking is More Energizing Than Low-Dose Caffeine in Sleep-Deprived Young Women." And it is conducted by Derek D. Randolph and Patrick J. O'Connor, who are part of the Department of Kinesiology, which is the exercise science program at the University of Georgia in Athens. And this paper came out in Physiology and Behavior 2017, so it's a few years old. But I kind of thought it was really interesting because the subjects of this study are people that I teach on the day-to-day. So I don't just teach sleep-deprived young women, but certainly the cohort of students that were examined sat between the ages of 18 and 23. So a lot of our undergrad students are around that age. And what they were trying to do in this particular paper is trying to figure out whether caffeine or brief bursts of exercise are a more effective way of energizing people through their afternoon slump. And we all know what that afternoon slump feels like, that 3 p.m. wall or that 2 p.m. wall. And there's kind of a range of reasons as to why you might want to investigate this question. Feelings of low energy and fatigue are both common and costly. In the US alone, the lost productive time from fatigue has been estimated to cost US employers more than $100 billion annually. And part of the reason for this is fatigued workers, so people who are tired, are twice as likely to report health-related lost productive time. So there's a range of economic reasons for examining this question, but there's also a range of health ramifications as well. And it's interesting to note that feelings of fatigue are most common among women. So women tend to experience fatigue a lot more than men do. So it helps explain why they're focusing on women in this study. So do you guys drink coffee at all?
Oh, constantly.
Yes, definitely.
Well, you're not alone, because on average, more than 90% of people in North America drink around 180 milligrams of caffeine daily. And so to kind of put that in context, that's equivalent to an 8-ounce brewed coffee from Starbucks. Does that mean anything to you guys?
Yeah, 8 ounces per day?
Yeah.
That sounds low.
That sounds like a pretty small Starbucks.
It does,
That's
right?
kind of what I thought, because down here in the Antipodes, one of the most common coffees is a flat white, right? And a double shot flat white has between 150 and 210 milligrams of coffee. And you'd say that a lot of people in New Zealand would probably drink at least 2 flat whites a day.
What's in a flat white?
Well, funny you should ask. So in Wellington, it prides itself, where I'm from and where I'm calling from at the moment, it prides itself in being a bit of a coffee capital. So a flat white is similar to a latte, but it's got a creamier, frothy milk at the top, and it's slightly more intense. So it sits between a cappuccino and a latte,
Okay.
I'd say. Do they not serve flat whites at Starbucks?
I think they've only just started bringing them to Canada.
Okay. So I don't know if you've heard about this constant battle around the pavlova whether it was Australians or New Zealanders that invented the pavlova?
I have heard this debate.
Okay, well, the same debate rages around the flat white. So, yeah, well, if they've just brought it into Canada, it's probably the best coffee there is, type of way of drinking coffee. So I'd recommend getting in there.
Good to know.
But, yeah, before we go off track too far, arguing about different brews of coffee and whatever, another reference point is that cola, so 12 ounces of cola, have between 35 and 50 milligrams of caffeine in them. Most Americans drink at least 180 milligrams of caffeine, and a 12-ounce cola drink only has between 35 and 50 milligrams.
Do we know what 12 ounces is in the metric speaking part of the world?
No, because I've got no idea.
Okay.
All right, let's hear it.
Can you convert it for us, Cameron?
Yes. 12 ounces is 354 milliliters.
Okay, so a can of Coke.
Okay.
A can of Coke.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sweet. So moving back to the paper, the authors were interested in looking at both caffeine and acute exercise because both of them are psychostimulants, and they can have effects on wakefulness and energy and fatigue levels, as well as things like cognitive performance. So in this paper, they were looking at energy and fatigue levels and also on cognitive performance and the effects of both caffeine and acute exercise on those. And their argument is that the psychological consequences of very brief bouts of exercise, such as walking upstairs, are not very well understood. And particularly acute stair walking, and those are their words, have never been investigated. So this was first of its kind study.
What does acute mean in this context?
I think it just means short periods.
Short. Okay.
So what they were looking at in this study is mild to medium intensity. So they weren't making the subjects run up the stairs. They were just wanting them to walk up the stairs at a reasonable pace.
Okay.
So they presented two hypotheses that they wanted to test, and in order to do that, they aimed to examine the energizing effects of 10 minutes of stair walking and the consumption of capsules containing 50 grams of caffeine. And they had a placebo which they provided subjects with capsules containing flour. So their counterfactual was this, just a plain capsule containing flour, no caffeine, and then they were comparing that with the effects of stair walking and caffeine. So their first hypothesis was that caffeine and stair walking will both increase feelings of energy compared with the placebo, and their secondary hypothesis was that caffeine and stair walking will both affect performance on tests of attention and reactions compared with the placebo. So getting into the research design was quite robust in many ways, but they only had 18 subjects. So the sample size was really small, and maybe we can touch on some of the limitations of the study later with having such a small sample size. And they also, part of the reason that they had so few participants is they basically wanted participants who already consume some coffee, so consume an average amount of caffeine per day. They wanted participants who were neither completely sedentaries or were ones that were highly physically active. So they just wanted people of average activity levels. And they also, the third requirement was that they needed people to be sleep deprived. And why do you guys reckon they wanted people who were sleep deprived?
So they're tired, right?
So they're tired. Yeah. And they wanted to again test, because they were interested in the effects of fatigue on performance, and that we know there's an economic cost associated with that. So they specifically were looking for people who were sleep deprived, and they identified these by asking people whether or not they slept more or less than 45 hours a week. And so that's about 6.5 hours per night.
So they wanted people who were kind of long-term sleep deprived, not people who just got a bad night's sleep or had to stay up late the night before?
Yeah, that's right, Susan. So they were really looking for people that had long-term conditions of sleep deprivation, and they were looking for people who were sleeping less, for 2 hours less than the national average per night. So the national average is around 8 to 8.5 hours. This is the US national average, and they were looking for people who were sleeping around 2 hours less than that per night.
I'm surprised that's the average. I
was surprised too.
I would have thought the average would be lower than the recommended amount of sleep.
Yeah.
And I thought the recommended amount of sleep was 8 hours. Mm-hmm. People are out there sleeping 10 hours a night, like to make up for all the people who are not getting enough sleep. That's what that sounds like to me.
Well, this total sleep duration represents about 2 hours less per night than a national sample of 4,546 US females aged 19 to 22 years. So the majority of females between 19 and 22 years, according to this other study that was conducted, were sleeping around 8 to 8.5 hours a night. I remember being 19 to 22 and I was definitely not sleeping that much, I don't think.
No, 8 hours has always sort of been the ceiling for me. Like what I strive for. Not that I'm opposed to sleeping more, it's just that I've never done it much.
Yeah, well, so because they were trying to fit these 3 requirements, they only ended up with a sample size of 18. And what they did was give the subject in various orders caffeine and the placebo and then the stair climbing task, and recorded the energy levels and reaction times after being given each of the treatments. And the results found that there were no significant effects on cognition or reaction times, but that stair climbing boosted self-reported levels of energy much more than a moderate dose of caffeine. So what they found for these young women is if they were feeling tired, the positive energy impacts of walking up the stairs were much more significant than having the 50 milligrams of caffeine.
Wait, but did you say that, but then the measured impacts were still nothing, or?
No, sorry, the cognitive impacts.
Okay.
So it didn't necessarily improve people's reaction times, but it certainly improved their vitality and their energy levels from walking up the stairs.
Okay, meaning like people self-report as feeling less tired, but if you test their actual reaction time, you don't necessarily see that.
Exactly.
Okay.
And because they did a series of tests, and that even though they had such a small sample size, it really was quite a comprehensive and well-designed study where they carried out a series of pre and post tests to understand the impacts of caffeine and stair climbing on things like heart rate and their mood and their motivation to perform cognitive tasks and that kind of thing.
So it's counterintuitive that exercise is going to make you feel more wakeful.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I guess the shortness of it is probably important.
Well, that's what they were saying in this study, like using short bursts of exercise hadn't been well studied, particularly stair climbing. And one of their motivations for this study is that the authors wanted to stimulate typical physical activity hurdles encountered by people who work in an office. And so this again ties in with our theme today of office fitness. And the researchers chose stair climbing as a form of physical activity because most office workers have access to a stairwell in which someone can casually slip away from their desk and squeeze in a quick workout without needing to change into athletic gear or shower before returning to work. And then they also saw it as a bonus that taking a quick break away from the computer and staring at the computer screen to walk some stairs can easily become an afternoon routine.
I go out to lunch most days, and afterward I have to walk up 4 flights of stairs to get back to my apartment where I work. I work from home. And I tell you, I am ready to pass out every afternoon. Like 2 o'clock, I am just ready to call it a day. I guess my exercise is not acute enough. I need to do 1 flight of stairs instead of 4 flights of stairs.
Well, what they were saying in this study, or something perhaps to think about, they didn't discuss it in this study, but other studies have looked at the effects of exercise and caffeine.
Now, see, that's the study I want.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay. So another study looked at the effects of either exercise alone or exercise plus caffeine on cognitive tasks and found that, and perhaps this is predictable, but exercise plus caffeine had the greatest benefit. So Cameron, maybe what you need to be doing after lunch is throwing back one of those flat whites before you walk the stairs and you'll be good to go.
Oh, you got to believe that I'm doing that. So I suppose there's probably no reason to assume that this effect is limited to young women, right? Or is there a reason to believe that it's limited to young women? Like if you're like a 50-year-old man, do we think that the advice is the same? I guess the study doesn't really tell us that.
Well, the study didn't talk about its transferability across age groups, but certainly the reason that they seem to focus on young women in this case was because the effects of fatigue on young women are often found to be more pronounced. But that would be an opportunity for further study to take the same research design and use it across a broader cohort to see if the effects are the same. One of the problems with having such a small sample size means that creating broad generalizations can be a bit risky, because when you have such a small sample size, there's always the risk of bias.
But we were just talking about self-reported stuff anyway, so I guess like you could just try it. And if you feel better, then
go with it.
Oh, you mean for our listeners?
For our listeners,
yeah.
Like,
well, I think it makes sense.
That tells us about as much as the study tells us.
Yeah.
I feel like this study follows along with like conventional wisdom too, right? Where if you're feeling tired in the afternoon, you walk around the block and then you go back to your desk and try again. So it makes a lot of sense to me to walk up the stairs and yeah.
One of the take-home messages for our listeners, irrespective of age perhaps, is that although caffeine can provide a boost in alertness and energy levels, and a range of studies have shown this, that may help our listeners to think faster or better or whatever. But so might exercise. So there are some benefits that come from caffeine. Research has shown again that regular intake has been associated with a lower risk of type 2 diabetes, that can help with high blood pressure and obesity. It can have negative impacts as well, such as some studies have suggested that caffeine can have repercussions for bone loss and rheumatoid arthritis, whereas the benefits from exercise across the board generally understood to be great. So if you're trying to decide whether to walk up some stairs, even if it's in force for you, Cameron, or reach for that cup of coffee, maybe walking up the stairs is a good option.
All right. Shall we move on?
Sure.
So Susan, let's go to your article.
Yeah, so sticking with the office fitness theme, the article that I looked at is called Treadmill Workstations, the Effects of Walking While Working on Physical Activity and Work Performance. And this was done by authors in Minnesota in the US and published in the journal PLOS ONE. And I'll just read you quickly our useful science summary from the website, which says, employees who used a walking treadmill workstation at speeds up to 2 miles per hour showed an increase in productivity over a period of 1 year. And so what they did in this study was that the researchers at the university partnered with a financial services company. I don't know whether that means a bank or accountants, but either way, it was, office desk workers, and offered them a treadmill desk. And with a treadmill desk, you can choose to either sit or stand or walk basically at any speed up to 2 miles per hour, which I did the conversion on that one. That's 3.2 kilometers per hour. And the theory that the authors were working with was that sedentariness and physical inactivity causes or aggravates a number of physical illnesses and also a number of psychological illnesses as well. And they were hypothesizing that it's reduced activity at work, not reduced activity in off hours and leisure time, that has contributed more to the obesity epidemic. But what they didn't know was whether adding physical activity would also improve work performance as well as improving kind of fitness. And so they had two hypotheses for this study. The first one was that if you gave workers a treadmill workstation, that it would increase their level of physical activity. And the second one was that if you gave them treadmill workstations, it would enhance their performance once they figured out how to work using a treadmill workstation. So there's a great quote in the article, actually, that says, "Walking is a hindrance to tasks that require a steady posture and the use of hands for precise execution, such as typing and using a computer mouse. On the other hand, walking may complement the execution of complex cognitive tasks because it reduces stress and increases the size of the hippocampus and improves memory." So they were hoping to get quite a lot out of issuing these treadmill desks to the employees. And so they asked for volunteers at this financial services company, and they took the first 40 people who volunteered. And half of them got a treadmill desk at the beginning of the study, and then the others got a treadmill desk about 6 months into the study. And they issued everybody with an accelerometer and measured their total daily calorie expenditure, and then also measured how much time people spent being sedentary, how much time they spent being sort of lightly active, and how much time they spent being quite active. And they measured that during work hours and also outside of work hours. But then, because they wanted to know about productivity, they also asked everybody who participated to assess their own performance every week, both in terms of quantity of work that they got through and the quality of the work that they got through. And then more importantly, they also asked all of the supervisors to fill out an assessment about how well the employee had done that week, which they did for an entire calendar year. So the results of this: people with a treadmill increased their calorie expenditure by an average of 74 calories a day, which, I looked this up, that's about 1.5 Oreos or half a Starbucks flat white.
Oh, you're onto flat whites.
And the amount of sedentary time for people with the treadmill decreased by more than an hour a day. So that was activity that bumped up into either lightly active or quite active instead of being sedentary. And overall, self-reported work performance increased by about 0.69 points on their scale out of 10 that they were measuring on. And their supervisors actually judged that work performance had increased by 1.1 points. But the really interesting thing was that, as the authors had predicted, the self-reported performance actually fell for about 18 weeks before it went back up to pre-treadmill levels and then eventually beyond it. Which means it took people 18 weeks to get used to walking on a treadmill.
18 weeks? That's a long time.
Yeah.
Jeez, I would not last that long. I'd last maybe 18 hours. I'd give up.
I guess that's an interesting thing about this study, because they ran it over the course of a year. It's really hard to say whether it went down for 18 weeks because that's how long it takes to get used to walking on a treadmill while you work, or whether, that was less busy season for whatever industry this is, and it actually was something totally unrelated, which isn't uncommon when you run a study for a year. Sometimes there are seasonal things that the researchers don't know about that change the way that people work, or how work ebbs and flows. So yeah, I guess the question is, with an increased 74 calories and 1 hour less of sedentary time and a 0.69 increase in work performance, is it actually worth it? Should we all start installing treadmills in everybody's offices? And the authors actually speak to this directly. They said it cost about $4,000 to install these treadmills in people's offices, per treadmill.
So $4,000 per treadmill.
$4,000 per treadmill. Now they say you can get this for $1,000 on Amazon now, but that's still quite a substantial investment.
It probably about doubles the floor space you need for that single employee.
I would think so. And these were definitely, they had some photos in the article. These were sort of cubicle workers. So they are either in much bigger cubicles than I've ever worked in, or they had to make some space for this.
Also, treadmills aren't exactly quiet. Maybe at a walking speed, it's not that loud.
Yeah, I would have liked to hear from the people who had to work next door to the person walking on their treadmill all day.
Right, or once you've put like 20 of these in one room, like what's that environment like? I guess offices are already loud and distracting environments.
That's true. Certainly all the ones I've ever worked in.
So was these 0.69 out of a scale of 10?
Yeah.
So it's almost 7% increase in productivity.
Yeah, but not until, 18 weeks after.
So there's a huge time investment.
Yeah. The other interesting thing, I think, if we're talking about this study, is the idea of volunteer bias. So this study didn't take the people who work at this company and randomly assign people to a treadmill. They asked for the first 40 people to volunteer, and those were the people that got the treadmill. And so volunteer bias, which, where a systematic error comes up in a study just based on the fact that the people who choose to volunteer are different than the people who didn't choose to volunteer. That's quite common in a lot of studies. And it's worth asking whether the people who volunteered were more likely to stick with the idea of having a treadmill and walking on it throughout because they were volunteers and they wanted this in the first place.
Well, I think it's interesting when we talk about the impacts of walking on productivity or creativity, because certainly in the last few years, there's been quite a few studies that have come out and said, I know this steps slightly outside of putting a treadmill in the office, but certainly the benefits of walking can really help the creative and the thinking process. So I've just been looking up this old New Yorker article that I remembered reading from a while ago, and it's titled Why Walking Helps Us Think, and it explains why walking and thinking can be such great companions. But I should note here, it's not saying walking and working, it's saying walking and thinking. And it says...
That's something I wonder about too, because I know we've published other summaries on useful science before that have said, a walk in the woods is a really great thing for creativity.
Exactly.
And so is it walking, or is it the change of atmosphere and everything around you, some fresh air that's really productive?
Well, I'm not sure if the useful science thing you're referring to is the study that came out of Stanford, but there was one that came out of Stanford where they found that creative output increased 60% when a person was walking. So that's really significant. Again, creative output is different from productivity, which is what your study was examining, but the results were highly significant in that particular study. And again, I'm going to quote from this New Yorker article, but it says many experiments have shown that after or during exercise, even very mild exertion, people perform better on tests of memory and attention. Walking on a regular basis also promotes new connections between brain cells, staves off the usual withering of brain tissue that comes with age, increases the volume of the hippocampus, which is what you were saying, Susan, and elevates levels of molecules that both stimulate growth of new neurons and transmit messages between them. But again, it might be the type of walking that you're doing, and treadmill walking might be not driving those kind of developments.
Mm-hmm. The other interesting thing that they did in this study, because of course they had all of these self-assessments and supervisor assessments, was to tell the employees that all of that information was going to be kept confidential with the researchers and not fed back to, the higher ups at the organization. So hopefully nobody was going to end up having their job terminated or anything like that by honestly saying, I didn't do so much this week. But on the other hand, when you do a study in a workplace and you're filling out questions like that, and you want to look good for your boss, and you know that your company has sunk some money into bringing in researchers and putting in treadmills, you might not want to give a negative impression. And so that's something that's often called social desirability bias, where you want to give the good impression. And so you might not answer a survey in a way that says, I had a really bad, unproductive week, but instead answer something that makes you look good or looks good to others.
I think that was potentially one of the problems with the study I was looking at too, this problem of bias and honesty in questionnaires. They were asking participants to not drink caffeine, for instance, in the 6 hours preceding the experiment, but there was no way of really testing or checking whether people had or had not consumed caffeine in the morning, for instance. And all of these kind of things, I know these are slightly different to the cognitive biases you're talking about, Susan, but all of these biases can influence the results of the study.
Absolutely. One of the interesting things about the article that you talked about was that because they had caffeine, they were able to at least blind it a little bit between caffeine pills and just flour pills. Really hard to blind a honkin' big treadmill office.
Did they have a control group in your study?
You know what? They did have a non-walker group, but they didn't spend too much time looking at that. They did have the group that got their treadmills later, and it did look like they, I think, followed a fairly similar pattern, but they didn't go into too much detail.
What are your thoughts, Cameron?
Okay, I have a few thoughts. I have found walking to be really beneficial for creativity, like for problem solving. I have always suspected that it was because I was just forcing myself to stop working and just like not answer email, like just kind of do nothing but think about a problem for a while in a way that like I would feel weird just like sitting on my chair and staring at my computer screen for 15 minutes doing nothing, but like walking 15 minutes that lets me do that. But I don't know, maybe there is something physical about it as well. I don't know, that would be interesting to know. My other thought about all of this was it would be interesting to know what sorts of tasks people are up to. And if there are some tasks that are more benefited by a treadmill than others. One thing I've heard about treadmill desks is that you lose a lot of mouse dexterity. In fact, people recommend you use those little like rollerball mice. So if you were doing some tasks like graphic design where you need a little more dexterity, I wonder if that would be more of an issue versus something that was more keyboard based like coding.
I imagine it would have to be. I don't see how you could edit photos while walking on a treadmill.
Right. I guess you could get at it maybe. I don't know.
And I just in general find multitasking quite difficult. The idea of trying to move my legs and move my hands and everything simultaneously sounds pretty overwhelming. Right. I would definitely be taking up to 18 weeks to figure out how to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that I would do very well walking on a treadmill while trying to write a paper. I don't think I could type and walk at the same time. I could see the benefits, although it might look weird to my colleagues, of walking on a treadmill while in meetings, because I do a lot of like video conference meetings. I think I could walk and talk.
Yeah, that sounds great. That would help me. It's hard to pay attention in a meeting without zoning off, and I think that being in motion would probably help me with that.
Well, some of these studies, again, around walking have shown that having walking meetings can improve the productivity and creativity that comes out of the meeting. And so what you're hypothesizing has actually been shown to happen. And also some of the great thinkers all advocated the benefits of walking. So Einstein, for instance, was known to walk the 1.5 miles from his home to Princeton, where he taught classes every day, and would often conduct his lectures while walking around the grounds of the campus. Darwin was another one who was said to have taken 3 45-minute walks every day to get him thinking. And I'm actually embarrassed to say this, but I can never say this name. But who's the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche? Is that how you say it?
Nietzsche?
Yeah. Okay, yes. He said it is only ideas gained from walking that have any worth. So there's a lot of people who have said that walking is a great way to think.
Yeah. I had a standing desk for a while, and most people I know who have tried standing desks didn't really stick with it, and that was the case for me too. I had it for about half a year, and I liked it, but eventually I just stopped doing it.
I feel like there have been a lot of these things over the years as well. I remember when everybody had one of those big exercise balls to sit on at their desk.
Yeah.
Standing desks were another. I'd love to see the experiment that put these all in a sort of head-to-head comparison. You know, randomly assign, you get a treadmill desk, you get a standing desk, you get to sit on an exercise ball, and you get to go for a walk around the block at 2 p.m.
Yeah.
And then we'll see.
I like to do housework if I'm on a conference call. I'll like do the dishes. It's a nice way to like keep my body occupied to help me like stay focused on what I'm hearing.
I feel as though you'd take less than 18 weeks to conquer this treadmill, Cameron. That sounds impressive.
Maybe so. Well, I mean, I'll stop doing the dishes if I need to talk on the call. Yeah, I would be interested in trying a treadmill desk. I don't know. I don't want to have that in my home. It's just too much space.
I think you're right about that.
Yeah.
I have an office, so don't have to try and work at home like you, Cameron, but I am going to tap out of the treadmill desk option. I feel as though the investment and the opportunity cost is too great. But I will advocate for walking up the stairs.
And flat whites.
For my job, my biggest like productivity investment was just 2 giant monitors. sitting in front of two 27-inch monitors and putting that over the top of the treadmill desk, like it's a bit much. It's all a bit extra.
Well, on that note,
sounds good.
Yeah.
I should encourage our listeners, if they have experience with treadmill desks, to let us know. Like, it's my thinking that it would work better for some tasks than others. I wonder if that actually holds true. I wonder if, like, are thinking that it would be hard to mouse if that's the sort of thing you'd get used to it. Or if you always feel like your mouse is kind of wobbling up and down the screen as your body moves around.
One thing I was thinking a treadmill desk would be kind of good for is a calling center.
I can see that, yep.
Yeah.
I'm sure those people are essentially sitting shoulder to shoulder in the tiniest desk they could be provided with in horrible environments.
Exactly. So if they've got to fit a treadmill in there, they're all going to get more space.
Well, that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you have feedback, you can reach us at podcast@usefulscience.org. You can also find us on Reddit at /r/usefulscience. We post the episodes there, so that's a good place to discuss anything you want to talk about in the episode. You can follow us on Twitter at UsefulSci, and we have a Facebook page, which you can just search for. I want to thank our great editor from the Moorhead Planetarium, Vivian Lee. I want to thank the composer for our intro music, Solomon Krause and La. My name is Cameron Spencer. You can follow me on Twitter at Eusonic, EUSONIC.
Thanks, Cameron. I'm Julia Torbett-Jones. I'm at Victoria University of Wellington, and I don't have any social media. Sorry.
And I'm Susan Rogers Van Kettwijk. You can find me on Twitter at SuzyRVK. That's SUZYRVK.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a very useful week.